Government.
Government dollars. The government, federal government, $1 billion. All federal dollars. $1 billion. The federal government dollars. All federal.
Mr. Chairman, federal government. Federal government recognizes federal dollars. $1 billion.
Government. Mr.
Chairman, federal government, $1 billion. Dollars, the government, federal dollars, the federal. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Dollars, Chairman, $1 billion, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, government dollars, federal $1 billion.
Mr. Chairman, the chair, Mr. Government, Mr. $1 billion, government dollars, Mr. Chairman, dollars.
Chairman, dollars, $1 billion, $1 billion.
Recognizes federal government, federal,
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Billion,
Mr. Government,
$1 billion.
Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes Mr.
Chairman,
The chair recognizes
Mr. Chairman, the federal government, Mr. Dollars,
Mr. Chairman,
the federal government, Mr. Chairman,
The chair recognizes
Mr. Chair, dollars, chair of federal.
the federal government,
Federal government dollars.
The chair recognizes
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Federal Government, $1 billion.
government. The chair recognizes
Mr. Chairman,
The chair recognizes
Mr. Chairman, Mr.
The chair recognizes
Mr. Chairman, government, Mr. Federal, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes
Mr. Chairman, $1 billion, $1 billion, $1 billion, $1 billion, the government. Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes Mr.
Chairman,
Mr. Dollars,
The chair recognizes
Mr. Chairman, the government
Dollars, the government dollars, $1 billion, the government $1 billion.
government, the chair, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes
Mr. Federal Government,
The federal
dollars, the federal government,
$1 billion, $1 billion,
billion government.
The chair recognizes
Mr. Chairman, the chair of dollars, Mr.
$1 billion.
The federal, Mr.
The chair recognizes
Mr. Chairman, $1 billion, Mr. Billion, federal dollars.
government.
Chairman, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes
Dollars.
Mr. Billion,
Mr. Chairman, recognizes.
The chair recognizes
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Dollars, the federal, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes
Mr. Chairman, the federal government dollars, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes
$2 billion.
The chair recognizes Mr. Federal Government,
Mr. Billion,
Mr. Chairman.
$1 billion, federal, Mr.